Hello, everybody.
Hello,
Hey,
Dr.
Professor, how are you?
Hi. Today, want to do a couple of things, and we've got a special guest today that I mentioned would be with us, and so we'll get with the special guest here in just a minute. But first, before we get too far along, I just want to let you know that we do have a new unit that we're starting today, and let me share that with you real quick. So if we go to, well, let's look here at the student view. We've got a new unit, as I mentioned, and all the fall of the imperial presidency. And what we want to look um, at this point, now, this time normally refers to, and the verbiage, the imperial presidency, normally refers to a trend in presidential strength and power that started in the 1930s, roughly, Roosevelt administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and continues gradually up until the presidency of Richard Nixon. And it means a time that the presidency was growing in power and authority, and I guess visibility. I mean, we'd always had presidents, and of course, they were always the chief executive officer, but um, it wasn't until about the 1930s that they really are seen and beginning to challenge the power of Congress. For the most part, a lot of people look to Congress to make the laws, which it still does, and it has done. But the role of the presidency as a moral leader has always been around. I mean, certainly Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s pioneered the bully pulpit, as he liked to call it. But with the advent of radio and most certainly television, post World War II presidents had considerable more visibility and maybe persuasion and power than previous presidency. And so this is where the term imperial presidency means. And it really didn't kind of become favorable to use until after Richard Nixon's fall with the Watergate scandal. And so, what we're going to look at is about a little over a 10-year period from 68 to 79, when the trust that people had in the government really took a nosedive, and people really started not being critical of the government. Pointing out the president's picadillos, and a lot of that has to, well, and other politicians' errors. A lot of that has to do with television, the importance of television after by the 1960s. So we're going to be looking at that, and there's some other events that happen. I mentioned Woodstock, the moon landing, among a couple that really also show another side to American history. It's real easy when we start getting in deep into the post World War II United States that there's a lot of things going on, and we're having to kind of parse them out and separate some of them out. One of the things that I want to look at is the idea, the rise of what's known as the silent majority. And this was a phrase that became popular in the late 60s, the silent majority. And it's eventually going to morph into other things, a more conservative viewpoint, people who thought the United States had gone too far to the left. We want to look at the moon landing and its long lasting impact on the United States. Particularly interesting since we're planning, we've got a new Space Force and we're planning on going back to the moon if we don't get caught up in the Ukraine first. And we want to look at the presidential administrations, the two presidents that bookend this. I mean, there was another, but it's Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter that really kind of give you two sides of the coin here. And of course, in the middle, kind of the forgotten president, unless you're a fan of Saturday Night Live skits, and that was Gerald Ford, who was kind of sad that we remember him more for his mishaps when actually, as far as Congress was concerned, he actually was quite a statesman in Congress. Remember that your perusal assignment reading is due February 3rd. I'm sorry, March the 4th. Looking at the wrong day. March the 4th by 6 o'clock. And that's just your first perusal. Remember, perusal is a discussion. And so you need to make a comment the next week. And that's why you want to do it this week. The first part this week, so you can do the next part next week. For your perusal reading in the 1970s, we have a kind of a new term that comes up that goes hand in hand kind of with the way society was heading at the time. And that was this idea of gun culture. And this really was a term invented by, well, not invented, maybe, but popularized by a historian named Richard Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter was an eminent historian, he was a leading light in what was called intellectual history. And we don't really see much of that anymore. Not that history isn't intellectual, but the term intellectual history, Hofstadter looked a lot at how people thought in what we might call cultural history today. He also is famous for popularizing the phrase anti-intellectualism in American history. He had a book by that, the Anti-Intellectuals in American History, looking at how America changed and kind of became the popularization of knowledge that comes apart as a result of the 1830s and how that carries on. In this article, American Heritage Magazine, he looks at how America came to change their view of what the Second Amendment meant. And, you know, this is something that's always debated. Now you hear this in presidential and other elections, but he's kind of looking at the change. And this is from 1970. So this is kind of when this comes about. And certainly this phrase, America as a gun culture, comes about. So I want you to look, among other things, for what you think might be the most important factor that changes that perception. Or you can comment on something that you find surprising or something that you want clarification about. American Heritage Magazine was a popular history magazine, but it contained the writings of well-known and well-respected historians, and Hofstadter was one of those. One of the other things we're going to look at, of course, you've got a couple of lectures in this unit. Hold on a second here. Well, for some reason, the videos aren't showing. You do have videos here. I need to find out what's wrong with that. You've got a couple of videos. One of them is on Woodstock, which is 3 days that happened in 1969 that were very important in changing the way American music. And we've been looking at music, so that's one aspect of popular culture. Then we have another one on the moon, Apollo 11 moon landing, Modern Marvels. That's from American A&E History Network, and when it was doing history, A&E Network. And then you've got one on the Stonewall Uprising, which also happened in 1969. Stonewall in the East Village in New York was a popular gay club, although it was not always safe to go there. And this looks at the 1969 uprising, which a lot of people say was the beginning of the LGBTQ movement, but it actually started much earlier than that. And if you go to New York today, the area around Stonewall, actually the Esplanade in front of Stonewall is a National Park Service, and there's a neat little monument they put up there a few years ago. But that's all National Park Service, and Stonewall Inn, which was the nightclub, is undergoing refurbishment, or maybe has undergone refurbishment. I've been there a couple of years ago, and it was still kind of in the process of closing and opening back up. You do have a quiz. Also, you do have a new You Be the Historian assignment, and I want to touch on that just briefly. YBTH 2. So I'm asking you this question. Why did people mistrust the government in the 1970s? And when you go in here, I've got some not popular, but primary sources. One is a speech. This is a famous speech by Malcolm X. And some of this is a little bit before this unit, but I think you need the setup. His speech called The Ballot or the Bullets, very famous. A little bit earlier than that is a speech, an excerpt, and this is not the speech. You won't hear Ronald Reagan saying this, but this is called A Time for Choosing. Probably the one that has to do most with the fall of the imperial presidency is a speech that Houston Congresswoman Barbara Jordan gave in 1974. She was on the House Judiciary Committee, which called and opened up the door for impeachment. And this speech that she gave, and it's only about 15 minutes long, is the speech that kind of changed everybody's mind that maybe it was a good idea to go ahead and have an impeachment. And so this is her speech on that. 1979, President Carter's crisis of confidence speech, sometimes called the malaise speech. There's an article here from Gloria Steinem, Women's Liberation Aims to Free Men Too. An article from Lamar University Press called Texas Civil Rights Laws Are No Protection. An article from the 1977 Texas Monthly called Support Your Local Police or Else. And a newspaper editorial, and there's actually a cartoon with this called Thou Shalt Not Pray. It's from the Dallas Morning News, 1962. And there is a link to the newspaper and also a PDF of the page. We can go over those later on. Right now, I want to turn to our special guest who's been hanging on for a few minutes. And I mentioned to you last unit that we would be having a special guest, and I hope you remember that. Everybody seems to be here. But what we talked about last time, when we talked about the rise of political liberalism, perhaps you saw the interview, hopefully you saw the interview with Joan Browning. And Joan Browning she was a teenager, I guess, right, during the 1960s. And she was one of many young people who risked their lives to challenge segregated public accommodations in the 1960s, a group known as the Freedom Riders. And we tend to have a tendency to think that there was one, but there were actually several groups of Freedom Riders, and Freedom Riders was kind of the brainchild of a organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, but other groups did it as well. And hopefully you got to see the video of one of James Farmer's lectures at Texas, what was then Southwest Texas State University, now Texas State University in San Marcos. I was there at that lecture. I had actually met Farmer, had lunch with him, and got to know him. So he was a hero of mine. And I hope you got to listen to that lecture, because he mentions the Freedom Riders and other people in the '60s, especially the Freedom Summers, who really risked their lives for the right to vote. And it's something that I think we don't in our day really pay that much attention to anymore. So let me introduce Joan Browning today to you. Joan, you want to go ahead and take over?
Yes, and let me share the screen because images speak louder than I do. And by the way, you have an exciting agenda. I think I may ask to work on it and
Okay.
let you explain to me the times of my youth.
So let me, can you go ahead and try to share your screen? I think you should be able to.
You cannot start screen share while other participant is sharing.
Okay, let me close mine.
You need to come out and.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and I do envy you. I think you have an exciting agenda here. Let me just interject into your next assignment. One of the reasons we didn't trust the government is that people kept getting murdered. John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy. And we figured if you could murder all of these people, none of us were safe. And so think about that as you look at the next session. What I wanted to do today is tell you a little bit about what the Freedom Rides were and how I got involved and what difference it makes to you. And I always start with Miss Ella Baker. You may not have heard of her, but she was actually one of the most important people in the freedom struggle in the first 3/4 of the 20th century. She gave a speech in 1964 that sounds as if you could hear that speech today. And one of us who's a musician turned it into Ella's song. You can hear it on YouTube. But let me read you a couple of stanzas of Ella's song that speak to us even now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. That which touches me most is I had a chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me. And so I carry on in Ella's song, trying to pass on to others that which I learned in the movement. Another person I always mention is Julian Bond. I met Julian when I was 18 and we were friends for the rest of our lives. Ella said that if you want to change the world for the better, you don't have to be rich or famous or go halfway around the world. You just step outside your door each day and do the good work that awaits you there. So it came to be called local peopleitis. We just do what's right in front of us, and if we all do that, the world will be better. And Julian certainly believed in that. Why do we study the civil rights movement and the Southern changes in 1997? He wrote about why we do that. He says, democracy demands memory. And up here, a tenants' right activist in Atlanta, Georgia in 1992 is quoted in saying, and when I go back telling them some of my history, they perk up their ears. So I hope that I say something will help you perk up your ears. Julian says that democracy demands memory. And let me give you a couple of other quotes. He said, mismemory of the civil rights movement threatens to erase the reality of the often brutal past, the class divisions evident in every institution, from church to school, the failure of civic institutions to service Black communities, and most of all, the cruelty and harshness of American apartheid. Does this sound current? We're still trying to misremember the civil rights movement. He goes on to say, in more and more schools, students learn about the democratic civil rights movement of the recent past. They learned that ordinary women and men were moved to extraordinary acts of courage, and they learned that what was once done may well be done again. And so I dare to tell you my story in the civil rights movement and speak with you today. I'll share enough of my story to put myself in the mainstream of my movement. But my main reason for telling about this story is to show you that even a person as ordinary as I am, as I was, can have a role in continuing the struggle for social justice. If we were meeting together and if it were safe for me to go to Michael's craft store, I would give each of you a little mirror. You are the reason we struggled in our youth, and you have the opportunity to continue that struggle now. So what were the freedom rides about? Everywhere in the South and in the border states as well, every facility in public was labeled who could use that facility. Drinking fountains were labeled for white and colored. Restrooms. And in transportation, on buses, colored seated in the rear. On trains, they sat in the car just behind the coal tender, so they got all the smoke and dust from the coal burning trains. The U.S. Supreme Court had started ruling in the early 40s that was unconstitutional, and they continued, and the Interstate Commerce Commission had issued 5 rulings that was not legal. Finally, in 1961, you probably have already gotten into in 1960, the sit-in movement started. And within a few months, more than 70,000 students in the South had gone to jail, sitting together, black and white, on lunch counters. The next step was the Freedom Ride. And it was organized by James Farmer, a good Texan. I believe he's from Prairie View.
Marshall, Texas.
Marshall. And Beverly at University of Houston in Victoria has a biography of him coming out, I hope, sometime soon, which may be the first full-length biography. James Farmer had been on a 1947 test of whether the first Supreme Court ruling on segregation and transportation would be obeyed. They just went through the Upper South, and some of them were beaten and put on chain gangs, and they didn't make it to South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But James Farmer had done that, and now he said, okay, let's try it again with these young people. So he organized the Freedom Rides. There were 2 buses. They got together in Washington, and they trained in James Farmer's philosophy of what, and many other people shared it, of nonviolent resistance. And they went through some pretty rigorous training and had their last supper, they thought, at a Chinese restaurant. And some of the folks from the South had never eaten Chinese food. So that was an adventure before they went on the Freedom Ride. The 2 buses set out from Washington. Their aim was to wind up in New Orleans on May the 17th, which was the date that the Supreme Court issued the ruling overturning separate but equal in public places. They didn't make it all the way. There's a book about the Freedom Riders that we all think is pretty swell. I've only found people who say there's one minor mistake in there, but other than that, as far as we know, that's the Bible about the Freedom Rides. So why does historian Raymond Arsenault say that the Freedom Rides were a pivotal moment in American history? Between May the 4th and December 10th in 1961, 436 Freedom Riders in 62 different groups tested compliance with the Supreme Court and ICC decisions. Dr. Arsenault said, quote, inspired by visions of social revolution and moral regeneration, these self-proclaimed Freedom Riders challenged the mores of a racially segregated society by performing a disarmingly simple act: Traveling together in small interracial groups, they sat where they pleased on buses and trains. They demanded unrestricted access to terminal restaurants and waiting rooms, even in areas of the Deep South where such behavior was forbidden by local law and custom. They did so knowing that their actions would almost certainly provoke a savage and violent response from militant white supremacists. Invoking the philosophy of nonviolent direct action, they willingly put their bodies on the line for the cause of racial justice. They appeared to court martyrdom with a reckless disregard for personal safety or civic order. None of the obstacle placed in their path, not widespread censure, not political and financial pressure, not arrest and imprisonment, not even the threat of death, seemed to weaken their commitment to nonviolent struggle. And then he says the Freedom Ride succeeded. Within 6 months of the first ride, travelers of all races were sitting side by side on buses and trains all across the nation without fear of arrest. The white and colored signs that had blotted the walls of Southern bus and train stations for decades were gone. And then he says the most important and lasting consequence, the one that confirmed the Freedom Ride status as a pivotal moment in American history, was a revolutionary change in the character of citizen politics. In the course of 6 months, the nation's first mobile nonviolent army expanded the realm of the possible in American politics and social insurgency. They redefined the limits of dissent and set the stage for the escalating demands and rising expectations of the mid and late 1960s. And more than any other activists of their day, they foreshadowed the grassroots rights revolution that would transform American citizenship. The lesson of the rides was the ability of ordinary citizens to affect public policy. They had proven that even a small vanguard of activists could initiate fundamental change through righteous action and moral discipline. Irish One of Us, the one who wrote Ella's song, Dr. Bernice Reagan Johnson Reagan said, Irish was the birthing movement, birthing the movements for women's rights, Grey Panthers, environment, gay rights, and many others. And when I get discouraged, I look at the cutouts on sidewalk and the braille on elevators and remember that the most successful movement birthed out of our movement is the disability rights movement. The iconic image of the Freedom Rides is the bus that made it from Washington to Anniston, Alabama, and was burned, attacked and burned. This, one of those Freedom Riders still lives, Hank Thomas, is in Atlanta, Georgia. The second of those two buses made it all the way to Birmingham, and under that pile of people being beaten with a metal iron bar is my friend Charles Person, who's still the last survivor of the second Freedom Ride bus. Well, okay, so how did I get on the Freedom Ride? When I decided to write about myself, I started looking for myself in the histories, and I found myself in a book by sociologist Howard Zinn. The book is titled The Southern Mystique, and in the chapter titled, Is the Southern White Unfathomable? I found this. Howard writes, every time we create a new situation of encouragement, another human being steps out of the shadows and comes forward. One autumn evening in 1961, my wife returned from a lecture on campus, and with her was a young white girl of about 19, slender, shy, a student at Georgia State College who came from a small town in South Georgia. She had heard that an interesting lecture was being given at a Negro college on the other side of town. She became curious, and so that evening found herself sitting and listening in a mostly Negro audience. On the way out, she and my wife had begun a conversation, and then there she was in our living room. We talked for a while, and she left. We didn't see her again until in December, I traveled down into Southwest Georgia to the city of Albany in an uproar at the time after Negro demonstrations. At a mass meeting in a Negro church, my first night in Albany, I listened to the chairman offer welcome to a group of students who had just been released from jail. They came down the aisle to the front of the church, and one of them was the slim, shy girl who had visited our house that night in Atlanta. Well, now, Howard doesn't name me in this passage, but I know that it's me because I took notes that night. And here's the first page of the notes. It was the 12th of October, 1961. The speaker was Dr. M.L. King, and he spoke about nonviolent civil disobedience in the future of the Negro. There were many things in my notes from that night that stood me in good stead, even down to now. He was introduced as a major prophet. Now, he wasn't yet a holiday. He wasn't yet a Nobel Prize winner. He was beginning to be famous in some circles, but he was introduced as a major prophet. And so on the way out, not only did I accompany Mrs. Zinn to their home, but I also asked Dr. King for his autograph. And so I have been one of the few people who have a genuine Martin Luther King Jr. autograph. I've often wondered what that dignified man thought when I popped up and asked him for it, but too late to ask. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee it's the student group that came out of the sit-in movement in 1960. Now in October 1961, they sent Reverend Charles Sherrard and Cordell Regan to Albany to organize voter registration drives. They were there when on November the 1st, the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled again that racial segregation in transportation was unconstitutional. They recruited 9 Albany State students. Albany State was an African-American college, to go down to the bus station and sit in. None of those 9 were arrested, so more groups went, and eventually Albany State students were arrested and spent Thanksgiving in jail trying to desegregate the bus station in Albany, Georgia. They had made 6 efforts, and then they called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee office in Atlanta. And office sounds very official, but really it was 2 hand-me-down desks, 1 telephone, and a mimeograph machine, and 2 staff people. So they called and said, "Can you help us?" And so that's how the Albany Freedom Ride became organized. 9 of us got on a train in Atlanta, Georgia on Sunday afternoon, December 10th, 1961, and rode through the countryside to Albany. When we got there, our plan was we would go into the, quote, white waiting room. We would sit down just long enough to say that we sat there. And then we would go out, and African Americans would take us to their homes and feed us supper and put us up for the night. And then we'd come back to the train station and go back to Atlanta the next day. When we tried to sit down in the white waiting room, the chief of police ordered us out. And so we got up and left. And when we got out the front of the train station, there was an estimated 300 to 500 African Americans, and they started cheering as if we had just done something special. And that upset the chief of police. So he ordered the paddy wagons and had us hauled off to jail. They first told us we were being arrested for conspiracy to overthrow the government of the state of Georgia, which I always thought was a little bit of overcharging, because all we do is take a train ride and try to sit in a waiting room. And then they changed it to refusing to obey a police officer when he told us to get on the sidewalk. Well, first of all, I was already in the back of this cab, and these are the 2 attorneys who represented us, Attorney C.B. King and Attorney Donald Hollowell. Excuse me. But my host for the evening had already guided me to get in the back of the cab with her. And so I was, first of all, there's no sidewalk there. And secondly, I was already in the car. Nonetheless, they hauled us off to jail. The people in Albany, the radio and television newspapers, named us all, and they wanted to be especially sure people understood there was a white girl. One of the visitors arrested was a white girl listed as Joan Browning of Atlanta. And in other news articles, they would list my apartment number in Atlanta and my telephone number in case anybody wanted to talk about it with me. And 2 weeks later, when I got back to Atlanta, there were indeed people who wanted to talk to me in the middle of the night. I was arrested in Albany. I was only 70 miles from where I grew up in South Georgia. Some people think going to jail is sexy. It has certainly has some qualities of deprivation. This is a picture of an Albany jail taken a couple of years after we were there, and it was used as a poster for why there should be federal standards even for city jails. It was a pretty nasty place. Well, the people of Albany had invited us, and then they were just furious that we were arrested. So while we were in jail, they kept marching downtown, kneeling and praying, singing, protesting our being arrested. Day after day, they would go down and protest. It was December in Albany, and even in the rain, they would march downtown. So many were arrested that they were put in this alley between the city jail and the county courthouse, and the people in Albany named it Freedom Alley. They had to stand there in the rain waiting to be booked for marching downtown. Day after day, they came, and it was always in protest of our arrest. Well, meanwhile, we're in jail, so what do? We're separated by race and by gender. So as the only white female arrested, I'm in a cell by myself. So we write notes back and forth to each other. These, I kept a bunch of these that were sent to me. Lenore Tate, another freedom rider, kept many, including some I sent to her. And these are now all at Emory University, and I think they may have been digitized by now. But there are hundreds of them. The one that the archivist always liked to show people is one written on a 6-foot-long piece of toilet paper. It has survived now 62 years and can still read it, so you can imagine the quality of the toilet paper. This is not one of those that the teddy bears play with on the TV ads. One of my favorite notes was on this napkin. It was from Jim Foreman. And he says, he sent me a tablespoon of salt. He says, I hear you're on a hunger strike, and if you eat this salt, it will help you. I didn't know it at the time, but the theory is if you eat salt, you drink a lot of water and you're not as hungry. It's easier to not eat. Jim didn't know that I didn't have water in myself. I went for 5 days with 2 6.5-ounce Cokes for my only hydration. But I was a good girl, and I obeyed, and I ate the salt and really got pretty dehydrated. But then we had other notes. We wrote on whatever we had. I wrote lots of letters to my friend Faye, and for a long time, some people thought that Faye was my imaginary playmate, but she wasn't. She's a real person. More and more people kept protesting, day after day. And so on Friday, Dr. King came to town and led a demonstration, and he was protesting. And again, they keep saying these demonstrations were set off by the arrest of 7 Negroes and 4 white persons in an attempt to desegregate facilities at the Albany railway station. While we were on ice, as it were, in the jail, our arrest had stimulated a mass movement. Sometimes people ask if I followed Dr. King to jail, and I revert to my 19-year-old sassy self and said, well, no, I went to jail on Sunday, and he didn't go to jail till Friday, so he followed me to jail. The people in Albany decided they would boycott the white stores in the downtown commercial district. They called it a Christmas blackout. And they sent out this letter to saying, dear friends, don't shop downtown Albany, save your Christmas money and give it to us so we can bail out some of these 1,000 people and these freedom riders. Well, eventually we did get bailed out, and one of the ways that the I'm trying to find a polite word. Anyway, the folks around Albany tried to squash us is that they would keep calling us back for court appearances. Some of the people in Albany, Black people, had bonded us out by putting their property up. If we didn't come back every time they called us, they could lose their property. So we were always careful to do that. One of the times they called us back was in March 1962. And this is the envelope that Attorney King had sent me my letter telling me to come back. I took the envelope back on that occasion because I wanted to show it to Attorney King. King, I don't understand. Why would you use a Robert E. Lee commemorative stamp? Well, and he just smirked and said, well, Miss Browning, that's my only opportunity to lick Robert E. Lee. On that occasion, when we went back, we decided we would all sit together in the courthouse the way we had on the train. And that upset people so terribly that they started yanking us out of our bench seats and pulling us through aisles and throwing us through doors. They threw Peter Larson was one of the freedom riders, was a journalist from Denmark. They threw him through a revolving door so that he was really quite hurt. They hurt Charles Sherrard. The other white woman freedom rider who was the observer, and so she wasn't jailed, was Casey Hayden. And she was from Texas, from Victoria, by the way. And she was always proud to be from Victoria, Texas. He was dressed in proper style and very stylish in white gloves and a pillbox hat. If you talk about fashion, Jackie Kennedy had popularized the pillbox hat. We all had a pillbox hat. I didn't have mine on that occasion, but Casey did. And her white gloves. And they pulled her across 3 or 4 rows of pews and dragged her out. We had not said we would resist being taken out, so I just got up and walked out. Chickened out on that occasion. Interestingly, this same newspaper shows that 2 Albany students were arrested for trying to use the public library. So it was a mess. That briefly is what the Albany Freedom Ride was about. Now, I don't want to bore you, but I want to give you enough information that you have some sense of what we were doing. So I kept all those scraps of paper all these years, and Nora kept hers, and we've now put them in the same place in Emory University in Atlanta. When Julian Bond came to teach at the University of Virginia in early 1990, well, I guess late 1980, he learned that I lived nearby, and so twice a year he would have me come and show my little scraps of paper from jail and talk with his classes. And I treasure this letter from him in 1991. He says, by all means, you should do something, not only with the materials you've collected, but with your memory as well. There's a great shortage of first-person accounts in civil rights history. Fill that void. And one of the things he wanted me to write about was how I went from being a white girl in South Georgia to being a freedom rider. So I set out to try to tell my first-person account, to try to fill that void. Who was I before the freedom rides? I was born in a little place in South Georgia, about halfway between Macon and Brunswick, which probably doesn't mean anything to Texans, but it means to Georgians it's the middle of nowhere. And to prove Miss Ella Baker correct that you don't have to be rich or famous to make a difference, this is the house I was born in. My family lived in this house for renters. They had moved up from sharecroppers to renters. And when I was a preschooler, we got along through the federal New Deal program that allowed us to buy our own land. First time we ever owned it. It was across the street from a Methodist church, which was an important part of my growing up. So that when I finally did write about myself, I titled my chapter Shiloh Witness. Shiloh for what I learned there, meaning it was a place of peace, and witness because I thought as a white person that was the most I could do in the freedom movement. When we bought that farm, we moved across Alligator Creek and went to Scotland Methodist Church. And this is the banner that I saw every Sunday over the Sunday school. I got an image of it, so I know what it looked like, but I don't know what colors there were. And West Virginia, where I live now, has an official tartan. So when I decided to make a banner and put in my house, I used the West Virginia tartan. God is love. That was our whole theology. I went to a two-room school, and that two-room school had 52 students and 2 teachers. And to keep me out of trouble, they kept shoving books at me. And one of them was a really big book called The History of Telfair County, Georgia, the county I lived in. One of the things that struck me all those years was something I read in that, and it was about the Wanderer. At that time was believed to be the last American slave ship. Slave ship Wanderer had landed a cargo of Africans near Brunswick, Georgia, and some were smuggled up the Okmulgee River to Jacksonville in the county that I grew up in. Here's a part of the story that even as a 6th grader, 11 or 12 years old, helped me see that slavery is evil. This is a story that a woman that the writer of this history called Aunt Tiny told about her grandmother. She said, Granny said that her grandmother was 5 years old when she was captured in Africa and brought to that county. Granny said that one evening a crowd of her friends and relatives went out to hunt guinea eggs. And Granny said that guinea eggs in Africa are as big as goose eggs. While they were hunting the eggs, they came to the big water. I saw a big boat with sails, and some white men came up to them and gave them strips of red flaming cloth. The white men told them if they wanted more cloth to come on the ship. And they went, and then the ship took off, and they were locked in a dark hole in the ship and never saw daylight again until they reached this country and was made slaves to the white folks. Well, one of my tours then, at 11 or 12 years old, on our farm was to find the nest of hens who forsook our hen house and went and laid their eggs in the hayloft or in the creek. I would go hunt those eggs and bring them back in the house. I could put myself in the shoes of that 5-year-old. I could imagine hunting an old hen and being lured into slavery. I still shudder at the thought of a young child who went out one day looking for guinea eggs and never again saw her home or family. And by the way, I've spent some time searching for that 5-year-old, and if the Lord lets me keep trying, I hope someday to find her. I grew up 4 miles from the plantation of a Georgia politician who loved to be called the wild man from Sugar Creek. He was one of the most outlandish racists of all time. This is a campaign rally when he was running for governor 4 miles from where I was a barefoot child. So this is who he liked. Shades of what's going on now, his people would go to county courthouses where African Americans, because of Smith v. Allred, the Texas case, could now register to vote in the Democratic Party primary. They would intimidate voters. So do not think that the current crop of people have invented something new. They're just recycling the same old stuff. I got to go to college because Sputnik was launched into space, and And it suddenly occurred to people that maybe there's some smart kids who could help us beat the Russians who aren't going to college because they have money. So there was suddenly money available to people like me, and I got to go to Georgia State College for Women, where I was doing very well. I finished part of my junior year by the time I was 18. But I didn't like the big white 1,000-member Methodist church, and got invited to worship at an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and I liked that much better. The president of the college was named Dr. Robert E. Lee, and he called me into the office one morning and told me that he had received anonymous phone calls that the church would be burned, the college would be harmed, and I would be harmed if I continued to go there. So I set out to see what in the world is wrong with going to church. And I found myself at Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, an African-American Methodist church college. They had been violating Georgia state law for some 30 years by each year inviting about 50 Black and white students to come and spend the weekend together. It was against the law for us to be in the same place, to share dorm rooms, to share cafeteria meals. The year I went, one of the instructors was the Reverend James M. Lawson, Jr. And Jim Lawson was really a super spreader of the word about how and why now to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. He taught us and inspired us, and then the Payne College students and he spent 2 hours training us in nonviolent civil disobedience and testing us. You had to be tested to be sure that you could maintain the discipline. This is what a radical group of folks we were, all in our Sunday school best. Well, I didn't know which church I could attend, so now I'm beginning to take notes. And here are some of the notes I took from Reverend Lawson. And then we decided to do something they call Operation X. So this is details of how we were taught to do a nonviolent demonstration. After the demonstration, we went back to campus and the students were so happy. They said, well, that went pretty well. Why don't we do a sit-in? And so 4 of us white students joined the Payne College students in a sit-in in Augusta, Georgia. We had agreed that we would do whatever the student leader told us to do. So after sitting there for about an hour, the student leader of the day, Bill Diddley, came and said, okay, let's leave now. Follow me, and when we get out the door, no matter what happens, turn right and run. There are people down there waiting to take you back to campus. When we got to the door, a Klansman in the crowd outside lunged at one of the students, and Bill Diddley, the Payne College student, jumped in front and got the knife sticking in his chest. He yelled at us to run, and we had said we'd obey, so we turned and ran. And we looked back and saw Bill lying on the sidewalk with his blood puddling around him. He survived barely because the knife stuck between 2 of his ribs and barely missed his heart. Well, we were witnesses, so now we have to go back for trial. The police charged Bill Diddley, the Payne College student, with carrying a concealed weapon, the knife sticking in his chest. And they charged the Klansman with carrying the knife he used to stab Bill. So we went and got a good introduction to Southern justice. The charges were dismissed. The judge said that Bill Diddley had suffered enough, and so he dismissed his charges. And for the Klansman, he said, "Oh, you're just no blowhard." Well, this is just a sampling. I did write about myself. 9 of us got together in the 90s and published this in the year 2000. And this is where my autobiographical chapter, Shallow Witness, appears. And then time went on and people said, the Freedom Riders must be something special. Some of those letters that I wrote in the Albany jail were reproduced, and they're in the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis in front of an image of an Albany City jail. Miss Oprah Winfrey, before she closed out her talk show, wanted to do a program on Freedom Riders, and she asked her staff to find as many of us as would come to be her guests in Chicago. She hoped at least 30 would. At that time, there were 182 of us still alive, and 178 came to Chicago. And we had a reunion. This is two of the Albany Freedom Riders and myself. And we had quite a good time in Chicago as Miss Oprah Winfrey's guest. And then in November of that year, the National Women's Law Center invited women freedom riders to be a program at their big event. And when he heard we were going to be there, look who said he wanted to come and meet us. So I live in West Virginia. When I moved here in the early 70s, I was part of a local Episcopal church, and we were cleaning out the basement. And the people who were in charge of the church threw this piece of paper into the trash, and I snagged it. This is the Fort Hill Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm the only person who lives on Fort Hill. And so I thought I had a special interest in this. This is a letter written in 1925 to the ladies of the church, inviting them to make some money selling hot dogs and coffee at a Klan rally. Well, when I went down to the local bank and applied for a mortgage to buy the property I live on now, the chairman of the board of directors of the bank wanted to come with the appraiser to look at the property. He spat some tobacco on the ground, and he looked wistfully up the mountain and said, you know, in the old days, we used to go up there and burn crosses. That chairman of the board of directors of the bank was the son of the man who signed this letter. Well, that was long ago, right? Well, in the year 2000, this flyer showed up near my home, inviting people to a Ku Klux Klan rally. Well, some of us said we can't let that go, and so we organized a community event saying that they don't represent what we think about and when we think about this place. We got some publicity, and then I started getting more anonymous phone calls. It's amazing how even like telephones, isn't it? Ella Baker. Spend all the time you will learning about Ella Baker. There are a couple of good books about her. She's all over the internet and Google. She and Jim Lawson really don't get the attention they deserve, or James Farmer. You know, we concentrate on a couple of people, but I refer you to these. And now I understand you may want to engage in some discussion if you're not asleep yet. How do I stop sharing? Oh, stop sharing. There we go. There we are. Okay. A lot of that sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. My name is Hannah Curry, and I'm just bowled over by this wonderful opportunity to, wow. I didn't realize who was showing up or who was speaking today when Dr. Poyce told us we were going to have a special guest last week. I didn't put the two together. So this has been such an amazing pleasure. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Hannah. And I am struck by how persistent the problems are. You know, voter suppression, intimidation,
Yes.
you know, the killing of Black men. You know, we sometimes think we did something, but all we did was take down silly signs. You know, we didn't really solve any of the major problems.
Yes.
But Dr. Arsenault says that we inspired citizen activism, which did continue through the 60s. Now, you'll learn in your next session how the silent majority were stronger than the grassroots activists in many cases.
Yes. This that exact thing, the backlash to the work that you and your generation did, is really what has become my focus as a history student. Is looking at the backlash, looking at how it arose, and just how insidiously it came into being. So, yes, ma'am.
Well, and I'm sure you'll get into the effect of the draft and the Vietnam War on that.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Especially the young men of my generation had to decide how to respond to the military draft. And some left the country, went different directions, but it's really hard to keep up a grassroots movement when you can stack off all the young men and send them away.
Man, I never thought of it that way. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Ms. Browning. My name is Greg. Thank you for being here today. Are there any grassroots movements today that you see that might parallel the freedom riders?
Oh, here in the mountains, they discovered that if you literally break the earth, you can extract shale gas, natural gas. It's a very nasty process. And then you can't put it in your UPS package and ship it to the customer. You have to build these pipelines across mountains. We have had some ongoing grassroots efforts. People have done things like chain themselves to trees in the line of these things. We've had some people who get in airplanes and make images so that the rest of us who don't see this going on can see what's happening. And it's still ongoing, and we still don't have a single pipeline all the way across West Virginia, although it's touch and go. Every new environmental hearing, every new lawsuit, we just have to be persistent. We have to be all eternally vigilant, because they will do that. One of the things that helps us is that by stalling some of this, where they have torn up the mountains to run these pipelines, the pollution, the wash off, the runoff has been so awful. It's like washed over highways, major highways. And so the nature itself has proven our point that this is not where you need to put pipelines. So who knows? I'm afraid it's all based on price. If Chinese will pay enough for this natural gas, they'll get it to them.
Thank you, Ms. Browning.
We're also kind of in the beginning stages of organizing for the right to teach history in public schools.
Joan, let me ask you a question. You mentioned that Farmer and some of the others are not very well known. We tend to focus on people like King and some of the other activists. Farmer in the video, and I guess I should have shared that link with you about the speech he made in San Marcos, talks about that there were many young people like yourself who came down to the South and volunteered to give up your tomorrows for the right to vote, to end desegregation. Were you ever afraid?
There are people who claim that they were not. I was if I had not been aware of the danger before Bill Diddley was stabbed, and this image of him lying on the sidewalk with his blood puddling around him, and then to go to court and see how that happened, I had no illusions whatsoever. One of the things that we traditionally did before going on a freedom ride was we made out our last will and testament. Well, I didn't know what that was, and when I learned it's who gets your stuff if you die, I looked at my stuff and said, who wants it? So I didn't make out a will and testament. Instead, I was dating a young man at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and he took me out for a night on the town instead of making a will. And I deliberately broke Georgia law. He took me to a place called the Top of Peachtree. And after dinner, he said, have you ever had Benedictine and brandy? And I said, no, it sounds right good. And it is indeed one of my favorite things even to this day. So instead of making a will dictating who got my shabby little belongings, I went out on the town. But yes, and in many of the letters that Lenore and I saved, that I wrote, that she wrote, and that others, freedom riders wrote, they wanted me to be bailed out before the others, and we had promised we'd all stay in jail until we all got out. So I insisted, no, I'm going to stay until we all get out. But there were rumors that some of the white men wanted to teach me what I should be doing with whom. They were very concerned.
I also wanted to ask you a question about being arrested and spending the night in those jails, and I think as you brought out here that oftentimes those jails were inadequate to handle the number of people, and they were grim places. Fannie Lou Hamer from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party recounted a horrible story about being brutalized in the jail. Was there ever any fear of being beaten or worse, raped? Maybe I don't know if that's worse, but for a young woman, white or black, in those conditions, I think that might have been, a fear as well, right?
Well, and I was really shocked that I was alone. I thought that I would be with Lenore Tate and Norma Collins, the other women on the Freedom Ride, but we were separated by race. The first night we were in a cell very much like the image that I showed you, with just bars across the front. And white men kept coming all night long and just standing outside the bars, staring at me. And I still don't remember much about that night. I've tried hypnosis to bring back the memories, and I just can't. I went into therapy at one point, and the therapist said, whatever happened, if you remember it, you can handle it. I'd always worried it was something so horrible that it would destroy me to remember. So she assured me that I could handle it. I have no idea what happened that night. I was not raped or beaten, but others were. Others were, and it was always possible.
We have time for maybe one more question. Does anybody have any other questions for Joan?
Well, let me tell you that Casey Hayden from Victoria, Texas, is one of my lifelong fondest friends, and she gives me a special affection for Texas. So if I can help any of you along the way, Professor Preuss can tell you how to be in touch with me. Well,
I want to thank you, and I've known you for several years. You come to Texas
yes,
once a year, and come to some of our meetings, our historical meetings. I think some people have been, heard you speak I guess that was 2 years. Was that 2 years ago at for the East Texas
Yes.
in at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches. And it was really, a crowd full of students and whatnot. And so I thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to my little class, as well as share it with the larger class, the larger group that we had there that night. It's a time in my life that we don't need to forget about. Time in
Well, I have been to the university at San Antonio a couple of times, and I've been to Victoria, and I've taken my picture in the Austin airport with the statue of Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan and I went to Fisk University Race Relations Institute in 1962. And I wish I had paid more attention to her, but I was enamored with a very attractive young man. And so at my free time, instead of getting to know Barbara Jordan, I wasted it on romance. But
well, I met Barbara Jordan a couple of times, and it was, I knew who she was and I knew about her, but it was always so brief, and she was always so busy. So Barbara Jordan, Sissy Farenthold is another.
oh yes, oh yes.
Recently passed away, and I got to meet her a couple of times, and
Ann Richards. You
Ann
produce
Richards.
fabulous women down there in Texas.
Yeah, and Ann Richards, she was governor, and I was I had a friend whose brother was Speaker of the House, and I was in college still, and so I got to meet Ann a couple of times, and I liked her because she was shorter than me. I mean, that says a lot. And
I was never in her company, so I didn't know she was short.
Yeah, no,
she was 10 feet tall.
Yeah, she was surprisingly short. So we and of course, Jim Farmer.
Yes.
I was really intimidated by him at first, but the more I've watched him, and the more he just that deep voice of his, and he was a man. And, those pictures of the bus burning, and that's him right there with his back to the
yes. Yes. Yes, and in Chicago, he and his friends had sit-ins in Chicago in the early 40s.
Right.
20 years before we did in the South. I mean, they were the pioneers.
Well, I'm glad that somebody's coming out with a new biography on him. He was never happy with the one book on CORE that was written by Augie Meyer. Who's a historian, and I've talked to other people and said, yeah, it had some problems with it, but they didn't have all the access. And Farmer's papers, when he died in I think 95 or 96.
Yeah.
He had all his papers go to UT, and so they're just up the road in Austin.
Oh, okay.
Chance to look at them.
They didn't leave them at Mary Baldwin.
No, and I had talked to the chairman of the department up there, and actually he was the one who told me that Farmer was still alive at the time, but not in very good health. And he had said that Farmer had wanted to send all his papers to UT because he felt that affinity for Texas, having grown up here.
The first time I was in the Library of Congress, I was looking. Anna Baker in the 40s was the membership chair of the NAACP, and so she went to every place. And I was there looking to see if she had come to my county, and she had. When I was 5 years old, she was in Telfair County, and she had the notes. She was trying to organize an NAACP chapter, and she said, Telfair is a mean place where they will not allow Negroes to vote. And Augie was there. Augie and Joan Grant were there, and they were so thrilled that I was looking at Ella's papers instead of whatever they were looking for. Mm-hmm. They were busy bringing me more Ella papers. And I shouldn't waste your time with all this, but it's just fun to remember.
Well, I'm glad to see you up and about. Last time you were down, you had a little spell, but that I see that you're doing well. You made it back home and didn't have to move in with Scott and Leslie and
No, but they offered. I do have East Texas in October on my calendar.
We look forward to seeing.
I hope to be there. And if I need to go to the hospital, just shoot me.
Well,
You can do that with a gun coulter.
Well, class, anybody else have any further comments before we go?
Just thank you.
Yeah, we needed more than an hour and 15 for this because I could dialogue for the next 3 hours.
Thank you so much for your time.
This has been great fun for me. I appreciate it very much. And like I say, if you figure out what happened with the imperial presidency, let me know.
All right. Well, thank you for your comments, and we'll have this up and recorded, and I'll share the video with you whenever it's processed.
Thank you. And if you have time to send me that link of the James Farmer,
Yeah, I will. I'll do that.
I'd like to hear what he said.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Have a good
Thank
day,
you.
everyone, and we'll see you on Wednesday, okay?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Yes, thank you.